With great excitement, I introduce you to Northwood University, a truly exceptional institution in American higher education. Since 1959, this private, accredited university has been a vibrant bastion of free thought and enterprise, standing out among the thousands of other schools in the U.S. Known as America's Free Enterprise University, Northwood is dedicated to nurturing the next generation of leaders who drive global social and economic progress. At the heart of Northwood lies the Northwood idea, a philosophy that celebrates individual freedom, responsibility, and the importance of moral law and free enterprise. This entrepreneurial spirit is evident in that 1/3 of Northwood alumni own businesses. Northwood is more than an institution. It's a movement that empowers students to think critically and champion liberty. It is a rare gem in today's academic world. If you're passionate about supporting a university that values intellectual growth and free enterprise, or to learn more about its academic programs, visit northwood.edu.
Hi, everybody. This is Saad. I've hosted many fantastic physicians, and here's a new one to the list. I've got with me Dr. Marty Makary, who is a professor both of surgery and public health at Johns Hopkins University. Let me just read very quickly before I cede the floor to you, Marty. You're a New York Times bestselling author. Your latest book is just out a couple of weeks ago, Blind Spots: When Medicine Gets It Wrong and What It Means for Our Health. We're going to definitely drill down there. But your previous books, The Price We Pay, What Broke American Healthcare and How to Fix It, Unaccountable, What Hospitals Won't Tell You and How Transparency Can Revolutionize Healthcare, and maybe a slight departure, Mama Maggie, The Untold Story of One Woman's Mission to Love the Forgotten Children of Egypt's Garbage Slums. Wow. Where do you want to start, Marty? Should we start with the latest book and then work backward to all sorts of other topics? Take it away. Whatever. Go ahead. Tell us the central thesis of this latest book.
No, it's great to see you, Gad. And, you mentioned people have a tough time pronouncing your last name. Well, I know that letter, the letter A in Arabic, it's actually in my middle name, Adil. And people have such a tough time with that I've just learned to go with the flow.
Well, before we get going, this may interest you, if only because you're a professor at Johns Hopkins. Many, many moons ago, when I was trying to decide what I would pursue my studies in, my undergrad was in mathematics and computer science. I thought, do I want to go into the behavioral sciences? Do I want to go into perhaps psychiatry? And at one point, the top program that I was interested in doing an MD PhD in was the one at Johns Hopkins. It used to be at the time, I think maybe the most prestigious one. Is it still the most prestigious of the MDs, PhDs?
I mean, I'm going to say yes, even though I don't know.
Your employers will be very happy with you. Maybe we could start before we get to the book. As someone who studies psychology of decision making, I'm always fascinated by, how people make decisions. So how did you, out of all the possible medical specializations that you could have gone into, what were the attributes that you looked at in deciding to go down the pathway that you did?
Well, it's interesting you ask, because after 3 years of medical school, I felt disillusioned. I felt like this is not what I expected. We were just really playing whack-a-mole. Sure, the operations and the medications were fascinating, and I'd learn about the mechanisms and the technical skills, but there seemed to be something really big missing. And so I quit medical school after 3 years, and I enrolled in public health school. I felt like this is where it's at. We can talk about occupational health and environmental hazards and epidemiology and learn good research methodology. So I enrolled in graduate school in public health, and then eventually missed the bedside care. And I love being a surgeon, so I missed being in the operating room, and I did a surgical residency. But I always had a bookmark to come back to these big questions in medicine that we don't ask, that we should be asking. And there's a lot of those. And one thing that I've noticed in medicine is that we just dismiss things really quickly. Good big questions as we go through medical school. We're taught that The age of puberty is going down every year by about a week and a half. And now it's 3 to 5 years earlier than it was just a century ago. And we would just sort of go to the next topic to memorize. And this memorized regurgitation culture to me was so deplete of real intellectual curiosity and the sort of asking of the big questions that was missing, that's necessary to really address some of these existential threats, if you will. So that's a little bit of my background, why I've always been interested in public health, how I ended up being a public health researcher and a surgeon specializing in pancreas. And of course, it ended up having enough crossover, since the pancreas is at the center of so many chronic diseases in physiology.
So, I mean, you said that you were intellectually disillusioned at that point. Now, your latest book is about blind spots in medicine. So, in a sense, have you come around full circle later in your career to that which originally had served as a warning flag that, you know, they may not be as much intellectual rigor as most people would otherwise think in the practice of medicine?
You know, there's a famous book called The Popularity of Fads and the Madness of Crowds. And it's not fads, I'm getting the name a little bit off, but it's basically about this concept of bandwagon thinking. And what you realize in medicine is that we're all good people. We want to do good. These are people who are dedicating their lives and sacrificing much of their lives to be a part of something meaningful and to help others. There's this incredible bond we all have in healthcare around the compassionate calling that all of us were lured to. But you realize that groupthink is a powerful force. And when we start surrendering our own independent thinking and just sign up for the program, we can do tremendous damage. So the book Blind Spots really looks at modern medicine and the groupthink that is causing so much damage today, putting out the wrong information, issuing bad recommendations, and doing the most dangerous thing you can do in medicine, which is recommend something with such absolutism, suggesting that it's backed by solid science when it's not. It's just a gut feeling or an opinion. And so all of it is all coming together now as we look at our chronic disease epidemic surging in the United States and a newfound interest as to why.
What would be, I mean, I'm sure there are innumerable number of examples that speak to the blind spots and the groupthink that you're talking about, but what might be the top three, you know, top of mind that come to your mind? And, you know, did you start by thinking those things and then in light of incoming evidence alter your beliefs on each of those three examples?
Well, if we ask the big questions we're supposed to ask, there should be good clinical wisdom or scientific research to support a lot of the things we do in medicine. But in reality, it's sometimes absent. And so when you look at, say, the top three things that we have done destructively, I would say at the top of that list is putting out the government and medical establishment misinformation that the food pyramid was the way we should be eating. And not only did we get that perfectly backwards, ignoring the role of refined carbohydrates, but it enabled us to put our head in the sand as the entire food supply got poisoned with hundreds of chemicals that are engineered to make food addictive and sometimes to increase your hunger level as you're eating. So then you overeat. And for the first time in history, we saw this mass epidemic of children overeating. And we saw this sort of approach of blaming kids for overeating, when in fact the food supply has been rigged. It's been rigged with these engineered chemicals. So I'd say it's the food pyramid. It's ignoring gut health and the microbiome, which is probably one of the most important organ systems in the body. It's the millions of bacteria that line the GI tract. And those bacteria are doing so many things. They're busy. They're involved in training the immune system and digestion, producing serotonin, involved in mental health, regulating estrogen, even producing a little bit of GLP-1, which is the active ingredient in Ozempic naturally. So we've ignored that organ system. No time at all in medical school, not a minute dedicated to gut health and the microbiome. And I would say that the third thing that we've overlooked is the role of environmental exposures. We have a food supply coated now with pesticides in a way that's so significant that in one school lunch program, you can detect 38 different pesticides. It's showing up in the urine of kids. It's showing up in the cord blood between the baby and the placenta. So we've got to stop and ask, why are we witnessing all of these chronic diseases going up right in front of our noses? Autoimmune disease, mental illnesses, obesity, cancer, diabetes, all of it. Is it really the fault of the public, or have we done something to the public? Namely, have we done something to children?
Now, the three examples you gave are in one form or another related to, the ingesting of foods. I suspect, though, that the cognitive biases that you're speaking of in medicine, might apply to many different fields. So, for example, in psychiatry, it used to be all Freudian and Jungian. It was all due to the environment. And then the fulcrum shifted to the other side, where I don't want to hear about what your problem is. Here's a pill, get out of my office so I can go to the next. So it became completely pharmacological. And of course, like most things in life, the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. Do you feel, though, that there are some medical specializations, by the very nature of what you have to study, that are likely to attract people that are more dogmatic, more prone to not altering their opinions in light of new incoming evidence?
That's a really good question. I mean, you see it in school, right? You see the type of student that really wants to ask the big questions and isn't satisfied with the quick dismissal of those big questions. And then you see those who just want to memorize and regurgitate, take the exam, and collect their paycheck every 2 weeks until they retire. And I think we've done a terrible thing to doctors in this country. We've told them, put your head down, focus on billing and coding, and here's your prescription pad. That's your hammer, and all of a sudden everything looks like a nail. And we're going to measure you by your throughput. I think we've done a terrible thing. I think healthcare has been a failure when it comes to the health of the population and addressing the root causes of chronic diseases. Sure, we can do an elaborate, elegant procedure to remove a pancreatic cancer here at Johns Hopkins, but when it comes to addressing why has autism increased 14% every year for 23 consecutive years, it's like we don't even have a clue. So the chapter of the book where I kind of go into this stuff is surprisingly, people are telling me it's their most favorite chapter. And what I did is, after talking about groupthink in the medical establishment, how they got peanut allergy prevention wrong and hormone therapy for postmenopausal wrong by unfairly demonizing it, and the food pyramid and some other examples, then I take a step back and talk about Leon Festinger and the idea of cognitive dissonance and all the stuff that's right up your alley. And that's the chapter that people are enthralled with, because I think it applies to everybody. It applies to how we see politics and business and relationships, and science is no different. We have a cognitive dissonance, a founder's effect, where we just stick to what we hear first, not because it's more logical or scientific, but just because we heard it first. And that's
I'm sorry, finish it.
And that sort of groupthink. So that's all I was going to say.
I'm glad, of course, you mentioned Leon Festinger. In this book, in the Yellow Book, in the Parasitic Mind, towards the end of the book, I have a chapter titled How to Seek Truth. And I offer an epistemological tool for how to construct a nomological network of cumulative evidence to try to convince even your staunchest detractors of the veracity of your position. But I start that chapter by arguing, I quote, if I remember correctly, something from Festinger, but I also quote two French psychologists who stated that our faculty to reason did not evolve to try to get at some objective truth, but rather to win arguments, which is very disheartening, right? Because that might speak about the lack of epistemological humility that some of your colleagues have, right? I don't want to hear about incoming evidence. I'm vested in the 30 years that I've been telling my patients that one thing. I don't care that it's wrong. You can't prove me wrong. So is a lot of it simply the typical failures of our personhoods that cause us to not adjust our thinking?
Well, I think you're onto something big there, Gad, and that is pride enters into it. A lack of humility magnifies cognitive dissonance. and to a point where it can cause tremendous destruction. And I'm not just talking about in medicine. Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. There's just the sort of pride of not being able to recognize we got that wrong, and we got it terribly wrong, and not just in a moment, but held on to it for years. And you see the sort of going mental acrobatics to try to make it fit. And that's exactly what Festinger was describing, is that the brain subconsciously, not because we're bad people, but because this is part of the human condition, lacks humility. It will reframe new information. It will dismiss new information in order to have the comfort and security of our belief staying nested in the brain, so we don't have to abandon it. And I think we have to recognize that bias in all of us. And the father of modern medicine, Claude Bernard, said, we all have our biases. We have to recognize them actively and then knowingly suspend those biases as an active, intentional process as we hear new information, so we can be impeccable.
I want to get it, because I think it's so in line with what you're saying. So bear with me. It's chapter 7, and I'm almost certain, if I remember correctly, it was Festinger, because I want to read it out, because I wonder if you have it in your book. Just bear with me a second. It's here it is. One second. Where is it?
I got into where he embeds himself into a cult. That was fascinating.
Yeah. So I think this is Festinger. If I'm not, hold on one second. Yes, Leon Festinger. I remember correctly. Page 142. You're going to love this quote. Let me read it. I'm going to read you the whole thing. A man with a conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree and he turns away. Show him facts or figures and he questions your sources. Appeal to logic and he fails to see your point. We have all experienced the futility of trying to change a strong conviction, especially if the convinced person has some investment in his belief. I won't read the rest of it, but I mean, it's basically your book. He's in one pithy quote. He's explaining the inability of most of us to change our opinions. And actually, I was on a show maybe about a year ago, hosted by a British psychiatrist. And he asked me a question, Marty, which no one had heretofore ever asked me. And he said, in your 30 years as a professor, as a behavioral scientist, what's the single most surprising thing about the human condition that you've discovered that shocked you? And I thought for a minute and I said, the inability for people to change their opinions once they are strongly anchored. So having said all that, how does someone like you recognize our frailties, you recognize that we have these big egos, that we're not willing to admit to our faults and our wrongdoings? How do we go about changing people's opinions?
Well, I think we need, number one, a civil discourse. We don't have that right now in medicine. In many areas of medicine, you're not allowed to ask big questions. But the purpose of science has always been to challenge deeply held assumptions. And so one of the things I wanted to do in the book is just show that when we silence dissension and we insist that everybody needs to sign up for the program, show allegiance to a broader institutional guideline or opinion, when there's really no science behind it, it's just kind of the consensus of crowds. It's an illusion of consensus. Then we can do tremendous damage. And it's not like we live in an age of enlightenment where we don't make these groupthink mistakes anymore. We just said opioids were not addictive for 20 years, igniting the opioid crisis. We told parents to avoid peanut butter for kids until they turned 3, thinking it would prevent peanut allergies. We got it perfectly backwards. It causes peanut allergies. And that bad medical recommendation in the year 2000, that medical dogma that was just reversed 9 years ago, ignited the modern day peanut allergy epidemic. The food pyramid ignited the move to processed carbohydrates and ultra-processed foods that ignited the modern day obesity epidemic. And all of these are self-inflicted wounds, right? The overuse of antibiotics is changing the microbiome of a generation of people. The dogma that, antibiotics won't hurt you. Well, that is doing tremendous damage, not just in creating superbugs, which will be the next pandemic, antimicrobial resistant organisms. It's already here. But the average 10-year-old has taken 11 courses of antibiotics. in their lifetime already. It's doing tremendous damage to the microbiome. And we're curious why chronic diseases are going up. Antibiotics are just one of many insults to the microbiome. But a study looking at kids who took antibiotics in the first 2 years of life compared to kids who did not at the Mayo Clinic found that kids who took antibiotics in the first 2 years of life had a 20% higher rate of obesity because we're altering the microbiome. They had a 32% higher rate of attention deficit disorder. Remember, some of those microbes produce serotonin, are connected to brain health, and a 90% higher rate of asthma and nearly a 300% higher rate of celiac. Isn't it interesting that all of those diseases are up in the modern era of altering the microbiome? They're not up. They are not higher in the Amish communities, where they are still in the subgroup of Amish communities that are avoiding ultra-processed foods and eating good whole foods from good soil and good farming techniques. So I think sometimes we can't see the forest from the trees in medicine. And I think sometimes with good intentions, we can do a tremendous amount of public harm from issuing recommendations when they sound like they're scientifically based, when we really know that they're not. And we crush the dissenting opinions.
Beautiful. I'm going to come back in a second to two of your examples, the evolution of the superbug and the peanut exposure, because there are clear evolutionary links there. And as you may or may not know, Marty, my main area of research is in applying evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology to study human behavior in general and consumer and economic behavior in particular. So let's hold that thought. But I want to read you another quote. This is from, I'm not trying to use my show to promote my own books, but it turns out that this book, 2011, The Consuming Instinct, the last chapter has a quote, arguably my favorite quote of any scientist, and I think it's going to resonate with you. This is JBS Haldane, who was an evolutionary geneticist, and he was basically arguing here that scientists go through 4 cognitive stages before they accept a new theory. So it's totally in line with. Now watch the 4 stages. So I'm gonna read the exact quote. I suppose the process of accepting will pass through the usual 4 stages. Number 1, this is worthless nonsense. Number 2, this is an interesting but perverse point of view. Number 3, this is true but quite unimportant. Number 4, I always said so. Right. So you start off by huffing and puffing. This is pure bullshit. What are you talking about applying evolutionary psychology to study human behavior? That's quack science. Right. Well, the same person who sent me that email 20 years ago, 20 years later, saying, oh, I'm a big fan of your work, Professor Saad. So it's the autocorrective. So if you're dogged enough, people will come around. Do you agree with hopefully that optimistic bent?
We just went through this. With prolonged school closures during COVID, right? A bunch of us, Shea Bhattacharya, who I know you're friends with, and sure. Vinay Prasad and Zubin Damani, so many of us, we were yelling until we're blue in the face that the schools need to be reopened in the fall of 2020. The data were clear from Europe. And for the next year, many parts of the country continue to shut out kids out of school, which is not bad if you're wealthy and you're part of the ruling class with private tutors and the kids are hanging out at the country club. Come here to inner city East Baltimore, and it was brutal. What we did to poor and minority communities was brutal, and it was a human rights violation. And so we just had this sort of discussion at Stanford about school closure policies, and a bunch of doctors and, I wouldn't call them journalists, but writers said, how dare they question public health officials? And then, of course, we all know that schools were open too long or closed too long. And it's like, you know what? A little bit of support at the time would have been, a little bit of humility would go a long way. We just had a study come out in JAMA Network. Trust in doctors and hospitals is down from 71% to 40% in 4 years.
Largely because of the COVID stuff.
I presume so. I mean, they didn't get into it with the respondents, but a 31-point drop in trust over just 4 years. I've not heard a single apology from anyone in the public health community I mean, we were fighting against so many of these cruel policies, not allowing a family member to visit their dying loved one for 2 years. I mean, I get it for maybe a week or two in the beginning. We didn't know what was going on. For 2 years.
But you could go to the BLM protest with 100,000 people. There, the virus won't spread, correct?
Doesn't spread at those protests. It cannot
doesn't spread. If you're progressive, you have natural immunity in your right.
It can't spread there. It can't spread at restaurants.
Right.
It can't spread at bowling alleys or bars. And of course, it cannot spread when 2-year-olds are napping in daycare for the 2 hours that they're allowed to take off their cloth mask while napping.
Unbelievable. Do you think, I've asked this before, you mentioned Jay, I've asked Scott Atlas, I've asked other people who were courageous enough to speak out against some of those policies. Do you think that a lot of the, now in retrospect, incorrect policies were due to just, the fog of war? Or do you think that there was, willful intent? So if you have to allocate 100 points to either, willful intent or just fog of war, how many points would you allocate to each?
Well, I think the fog of war argument may have been applicable for the first few weeks or months. But when you're talking about 3 years in running of ignoring natural immunity, when natural immunity, I wrote a lot about it and people came up to me and somebody said, how did you discover natural immunity? And I said, it's been known since the Athenian plague of 430 BC, and it applies to every other virus practically. So, it was ironic to me. I was starting to write the book Blind Spots, and we were in the middle of COVID. I didn't want to talk about COVID because it's so tribal and people are sick of it. But I was watching all of this cognitive dissonance play out, everything Leon Festinger described. It's almost like, the doctor, one of the cult members of the cult that Festinger embedded himself in was a physician, presumably a smart guy. And when the prophecy did not come true that the spaceship was going to pick him up, and Dr. Festinger was there, he asked the doctor about his belief after the prophecy failed. And the doctor, in a very psychologically naked way, said, well, you have to understand, I still believe, and I believe even stronger because I have so much invested in this. My family, my friends, my reputation, my job, my community. And you saw this unbelievable display of cognitive dissonance in the real world of how he had so much invested. He just cannot stop believing in it, even if the evidence is clear. And I think we saw that during COVID.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, so as promised, I want to come back to this evolutionary angle. So let's take, say, the peanut example that you gave. So as you know this, but many of our listeners and viewers may not. So in the field of evolutionary medicine, which regrettably remains greatly under-taught in medical school, would look at the Darwinian why of why our bodily systems have evolved to be of that form. So rather than simply asking the proximate questions, the how and the what, right? If you're an orthopedic surgeon, you don't necessarily care about the ultimate Darwinian why. There's an Achilles tendon that's ruptured and I have to fix it. So that's the mechanics of fixing it. But understanding the Darwinian why can lead to insights, like, for example, the peanut example. We know that kids who've been raised in allergen-rich environments are less likely to develop autoimmune diseases like asthma, precisely because your immune system expects to be triggered in order for it to work maximally. So had the folks who were offering those original wrong peanut prescriptions maybe studied a bit more in evolutionary medicine, then the correct prescription would have been blatantly obvious to them. So this is a long-winded way of saying, do you think there is value? I mean, I think there is value, but do you think there's a growing appreciation of at least incorporating a single course, a single module within the training of medical students on evolutionary medicine?
Gosh, I love what you're saying, because it doesn't just apply to the absurdity of the peanut abstinence dogma that the American Academy of Pediatrics put out that ignited the peanut allergy epidemic today. It applies to so many areas. So we blow off, for example, sleep in medicine. Never talk about it. Not a single moment. Never talk about it. Guess what? It drives high blood pressure, it drives mental illness, chronic poor sleep. We just did a study showing that it's associated with the development of Alzheimer's and early dementia.
Always lack of sleep leads to those. Is there a disease of too much sleep leads to diseases?
I haven't seen that, but I'm sure that it goes in both directions. But if you don't sleep, let's say you don't sleep well for 3 days. If you had 4 hours of sleep for 3 consecutive nights, what is your behavior going to look like? You are going to look like you've got mini Alzheimer's. Right. You're going to forget things. You're going to talk slower. It's going to take longer to process things. And what we found is that chronic poor sleep it's in the deep sleep that the glial lymphatic system in the brain engorges to sort of vacuum out a lot of the amyloid plaques. And it's actually a circulation. Stress produces more plaques, and good sleep can help remove them. And so we can go through all the technical biology, but you nailed it when you said, if we think about the sort of evolutionary basis for this stuff, it makes sense that we were designed to rest. And you can't, change that strategy and assume you're going to perform better, or else it would have been done in nature.
Exactly. Beautiful. So I usually give an example, the following one, when I'm trying to explain to people, and it's a medical one, when I'm trying to explain to people the difference between proximate explanations in science and ultimate ones. So take, for example, pregnancy sickness, Marty. So from a proximate perspective, pregnancy sickness, you could study how does the fluctuating hormonal levels of a woman affect the severity of her pregnancy sickness. Okay, fine, great. The Darwinian why, it asks, why have women evolved that physiological reality? And it turns out that pregnancy sickness happens during the first trimester, during organogenesis, precisely because during that very important developmental period, a woman should not be exposed to certain teratogens, food pathogens that could wreak havoc to the development of the organs in utero. Therefore, she evolves an attraction to certain foods. With pregnant women are attracted to pickles because pickling serves as an antimicrobial property. They're repulsed by other foods that have high pathogenic load. They will oftentimes throw up because it's the ultimate insurance policy. Hey, if something did get by, at least I get rid of it. And it turns out that when you study the severity of a woman's pregnancy sickness to the ultimate outcome of her childbearing, the more pregnancy sickness she's had, the more likely that she will have a successful pregnancy. So when you go see your OBGYN and he or she gives you a pill to shut off your pregnancy sickness symptoms, they are doing the perfectly evolutionarily wrong thing. So I lecture about this, Marty, in front of, say, MBA students who come from a medical background. They're surgeons, they're physicians, they're OBGYN. And then they come up to me and say, Dr. Saad, you're a consumer and evolutionary psychologist. I'm a physician. How come I have to learn this from you? How come I didn't study this in medical school? But that shows you that there's a whole slew of light that we can understand by studying the ultimate causation.
So, when you mentioned that amazing example, I thought of a little section in the book I wrote about Tylenol for fevers. It's a reflex. It's a dogma. Oh, the kid has a fever. We gave it Tylenol. What else would you like to do, doctor? What are we doing with this medication? We are stopping the body from its natural mechanism of heating up to try to rid it of a pathogen. Now, if a kid is visibly uncomfortable or in pain, then maybe it's just compassionate to give them the medication to help alleviate the discomfort. But that's not why people give it. They give it because they believe, oh, we're treating the fever. Why? What are you doing? You're messing with Mother Nature. And a new study out of Johns Hopkins found that when you treat an illness with a Tylenol, you prolong the illness.
Exactly.
And they did this study with chickenpox, but it's true of other illnesses, and we're introducing a medication. So where can we teach common sense? The NIH doesn't fund research that is based on common sense. It funds research on whatever the esoteric, and there's some good work coming out of the NIH, but most of it is just dinosaur research on chemical pathways at the end stage to develop medications or therapeutics, not asking why we are getting so sick as a country. When the Pima Indians in Arizona and New Mexico had their water diverted from the Gila River by settlers and ranchers, the soil was destroyed. And the American government, recognizing this tremendous injustice, decided to address their new famine by sending them free government food. But it wasn't organic kale and healthy foods. It was Spam and potato chips and other whatever junk food. Well, guess what? Their obesity diabetes rate went from 1% to 90%.
Wow.
So it's amazing. And the Indians in the same group that were just living south of the border in Mexico, they continue to have 1% rates of obesity and diabetes. So they remained healthy, having a different soil and water supply. Now, the US government sent all this junk food, and their obesity rates and diabetes rates went to 90%. So what did the NIH do? They dispatched their genetic scientists to go down there and draw the blood of the Indians to look at their genes to see if they could find a gene that explained their high rates of obesity and diabetes.
Right.
No joke.
Yeah.
No joke. What were they doing just before COVID? Were they studying food as medicine or general body inflammation or the harms of pesticides? They were giving money to a laboratory in China to study coronaviruses that they captured from bats 200 miles away in caves. What are we doing? And so we've got to redirect our priorities and start focusing on common sense.
Beautiful. What do you think? I mean, I suspect you're going to be for it. So interdisciplinarity is something that every university puts on the top of its mission statement. We support. But then I know from my own personal experience as for many decades as a professor that the second that I introduce some new program that is supposed to, by definition, be an exemplar of interdisciplinarity, then everybody becomes super clanship, right? They all become very territorial. So let's say I wanted to create a university-wide evolutionary program. The idea being that whether you're studying politics or medicine or consumer psychology, there is value in infusing it with evolutionary theory. So it really would have been the perfect interdisciplinary program. But then each dean to whom I pitched this idea would suddenly become very territorial over their little fiefdom, their little silo. Now, before I turn the floor to you, the latest 2 Nobel Prizes have just been announced. The one in physics went to AI researchers. The one in chemistry went to AI researchers. Now, to me, that was cause for celebration because it speaks to the value of interdisciplinarity. It was computer scientists who were winning the Nobel Prizes in physics and chemistry for some of the tools that they were applying in those fields. So what's your view on interdisciplinarity? Can we become better physicians if we increase our commitment to interdisciplinarity and so on and so forth? Take it away.
Well, I'm devastated. I just learned I did not get the Nobel Prize this round.
Next year.
I'll recover quickly. I've been doing this study on the average size of stones on Wolf Street, and I guess that did not put it over the top. No, you're so right. We've got to focus on these. So what we are missing in medicine, in our little busy churning hamster wheels that we're on, is the big picture.
Yeah.
How do we watch the public get sicker and more medicated right in front of our noses, and nobody is asking why? How is it that nobody is doing an analysis between autoimmune diseases in the general population and in the Amish community subgroup that eats well and lives off the land? How is it that we're not doing comparisons across parts of Europe and the United States where there are radically different rates of things. How is it we're not studying food as medicine? How is it we're not talking about environmental exposures? Maybe we need to talk about school lunch programs, not just studying Ozempic. And we need to talk about environmental exposures that cause cancer, not just the chemo to treat it. And so we get this tunnel vision. And what's happened is we have these giant medical institutions that are so siloed with their own accounting streams. They've got their own profit and loss sheets. And so they can talk broadly about we want everyone to play in the same sandbox. But as long as you've got your doctors on this treadmill where they've got to produce in their own accounting line a profit, then guess what? They're going to do what they're conditioned to do, and that is do what they need to do to survive. That means small, incremental, little scientific studies within their specialty that are not big ideas. And guess where we are now today? 1 in 6 NIH grants goes to health equity or diversity. We've got basically no progress in many areas of cancer research, despite a return on investment that's astronomically high in terms of the investment, and the return is pathetic. If you go to the ASCO, the cancer meeting, and you look at the top papers presented every year, and you think that's what we got for $300 billion, and from the government, maybe a fraction of that. So we need big ideas. We don't promote Ben Franklin thinkers anymore. If you show up in a university and you say, hey, I got a big idea, I want to do cross-disciplinary research, they tell you, put your head down, focus on getting your NIH grant.
Exactly. By the way, forgive me for interrupting you, Marty. At one point, there was a university in Southern California that was very keen on hiring me. And when they were going through my CV, one of the things that they told me is, well, we're a bit concerned as to how all over the place you are, because precisely my career is built on the fact that I've used evolutionary theory in studying human mating, in studying gift giving. I've looked at studies using testosterone to study conspicuous consumption. I've looked at how the menstrual cycle affects women's beautification practices. So, I mean, in that sense, I'm all over the place. But what unifies all of my work is that there's always a commitment to apply the evolutionary lens. But to them, to your point, I was all over the place. So rather than viewing the fact that I could publish in medicine and in psychology and in consumer behavior and in economics as a laudable thing, it was basically, I'm too distracted. I'm not a hyper specialist. And so they view that as somewhat with derision. Is there a way for us to change the perk system so that people are more appreciative of the big Ben Franklin thinkers?
Well, I think the NIH should identify people who have bold, big ideas. Just give them the money, give them $5 or $10 million, and give them the time they need to go and do whatever they feel they need to do. Don't burden them with all of these forms and grants and fonts and submission deadlines, and then they have to stick to whatever they said they were going to do. Well, what if the purpose of science is to chase big ideas as they become evident in the process of doing research, right? So I think we're not promoting Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin invented an amazing stove called the Pennsylvania stove. He invented the lightning rod. He was doing experiments in electricity. He was a pioneer in sanitation, in government, in the structure of government, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, a statesman. We don't encourage that anymore. So what we get are these bright, creative minds in college and med school. And then we beat them down and tell them, you need to focus on one tiny area, and look who we glorify. Look who we worship. Look who gets the job of the dean of the medical school. Someone whose focus is so tiny, you don't even understand it. Yeah. You don't even know what they're doing. And look, I'm all for sub specialization. I'm one of those guys. But at some point, you need to look at the entire system and say, what are we doing? Right. All of these chronic diseases are going up. As we prescribe more antidepressants, more people are depressed. As we prescribe more pain medication, more people have pain. As we prescribe more diabetes medications, more people have diabetes. As we prescribe more antihypertensives, more people have hypertension. As we prescribe more obesity drugs, the population becomes more obese. It's not causal. It's not from the prescribing, but we are missing something big,
Right.
and no one is talking about it. We need big thinkers.
Yeah, beautiful. I'll just say one more point about this, then I want to ask you maybe a few personal questions. I mean, personal within a professional context.
Yeah.
My favorite, I often played a game of, if you can invite 10 people, historical people, to your dream dinner, who would they be? And number one on my list always is Leonardo da Vinci, for reasons exactly what we're talking about, right? He's an anatomist and a painter and a sculptor and a futurist and an engineer. He's everywhere, right? I mean, he literally is bridging the natural sciences and the and art and so on. So I hear you. Okay, a personal question. Maybe it's more to address my own paranoia. I have massive health anxiety. So when it comes to my yearly checkup, even though, knock on wood, everything is good, probably 2 weeks before I have to go for my physical, I'm a complete nervous wreck, because I think that I'm going to do the blood test, and every single disease that anyone has ever studied, I'm going to find out that I have it. So I want to stay as far away, with all due respect, Dr. Makary, as far away from guys that look like you and that are wearing that white lab coat. If I could go on my whole life without ever seeing any of you guys, I'm very happy. How do you? Well, thank you. You're very kind. Look at you.
I want to be approachable.
That's right. Of course, the fact that just wearing that damn lab coat makes the blood pressure go up. What is it, like 10 points? I think. Is that about right?
Yeah, that we have more reasons to medicate.
Exactly. So how is it that someone like you, and I mean, you're a surgeon dealing with the pancreas, pancreatic cancer, arguably one of the worst diagnoses you can have. How is it that you can operate, I mean, literally and figuratively, in that world and never turn it inward, in the sense of, oh God, I see so much horrible things. Yes, of course, I help tons of people, but I know more than most people what could be waiting around the corner. If I were in your shoes, I would have jumped off the ledge already, because I simply don't have the ability to and maybe that's one of the reasons why I decided medicine is not for me. I'm going to go into academia, behavioral sciences. How do you do it? Are you able to completely compartmentalize and go about your business without ever caring and turning it inward?
Well, we doctors are the worst patients. And when we see a doctor who's coming in to see us, we immediately we look at each other and just kind of realize, okay, this could be challenging. They're going to ask about all sorts of options that we normally don't talk about. They may not listen to our advice. They may say, well, can I get an MRI instead of a CAT scan because of the radiation? It's almost like they know too much. Right. And then sometimes they just decline what other people would normally agree to. And other times they have too much medical care because they perceive that they have a belief system that more care is better. But I would say, as I've progressed, and look, I've spent so much time with people at the very last hours of life, and I see it as a privilege. I've gained so much wisdom on life from people reflecting back. I've seen families come together. I've thought in times of my life, I don't need to go to church. I have some disagreements with church, with what they believe. And then you see this church community rally around and nest around somebody who is dying in their community. And you look at it, you say, that is a beautiful thing to see community like that. And it changed my perspective. I thought, you know what? Maybe I don't agree with everything they say, but I want to be a part of something beautiful like that. So it affects you a lot. And I would say it goes both ways. We do operations, and then people have complications, and we think, gosh, if looking back, I wish we never offered them surgery. They begged for surgery. They had it in their brain that they wanted some cyst removed because it could be precancerous. They were in the borderline area of whether or not it needs to be removed based on our guidelines. They begged for it. We decided to offer it, and then they had a bad complication. What am I doing? What are we doing as a profession? And so the next time I'd consent somebody for the same procedure, I would give them a more full picture of what could happen, and maybe encourage it less, or be more neutral, or discourage it and see if they, how motivated they are. And so one thing that I observed is after doing pancreatic surgery for years, at 5 years, most of my patients were no longer alive. And that was after doing the surgery and oftentimes after they get chemo. And so I started doing something I just felt was ethical. It wasn't part of our custom, but it's just something I felt a moral duty to do. I would let people know when I'm going to do surgery for pancreatic cancer, when we discuss the option, that even with the surgery and doing chemo afterwards, most people do not make it out to 5 years. Only 20% make it out to 5 years. And guess what? A bunch of people were like, what? Well, then no, thank you. And I realized that when you give people all the information, they think differently. It's how you present things. In the past, it was, hey, you got a tumor. We're going to take this out. Yeah, let's go for it. We got an opening in 2 weeks. Can we get it in sooner? They would ask, and we'd be like, we'll try. And we'd high five each other and encourage them. They'd leave the hospital. And then I realized it's not about getting the cancers out. It's about treating the whole person.
Right.
Right.
Wow.
And that's what's missing in medicine. We are not treating the whole person. We all have our little subspecialties, and you get 15 referrals and you get bopped around and no one's really in charge of your care. And you need to stop and say, what are we doing in healthcare here? Who's in charge? Who's looking after and treating the whole person?
Wow. You were mentioning earlier that you often are with people at their last moments. And in my latest book, where I'm talking about how to live a good life and happiness and so on, I quote a palliative nurse. Undoubtedly, you probably have heard of her, where she tallied up the 5 greatest or most frequent regrets that people had on their deathbeds. Do you know what I'm talking about, Marty?
No, I've heard of this, but I'm eager to hear.
Yeah. So I basically quote those 5 regrets, but I want to put it in an academic framework. Actually, one of my former professors in my PhD, a psychologist by the name of Thomas Gilovich, he pioneered the empirical study of the psychology of regret, and he basically looked at 2 sources of regret: regret due to action versus regret due to inaction. Regret due to action, I regret that I cheated on my wife and now, I'm divorced. I regret that I cheated on her. Regret due to inaction, I regret that I became a surgeon because my dad was a surgeon. He expected this of me, but I always wanted to be an artist. I always wanted to be an architect. And so it's the path not taken. Well, it may or may not surprise you, Marty, that over the long haul, when people are sitting on the proverbial porch or on their deathbeds, the most looming regret is one due to inaction, the road not taken. So having set that whole thing up, if I were to ask you, you're still a relatively young man, so hopefully, God willing, you have many more years left. What would you be willing to share to us right now would be your greatest regret thus far in your life?
Not getting off the hamster wheel sooner. I came out of residency and subspecialty training in gastrointestinal surgery and surgical oncology, and I was off to the races. I was a busy surgeon, and about 15 years into it, I realized I don't want to keep doing this until I die. I want to ask the big questions in healthcare that we need to ask that we are not asking. And it took a while, and I missed out a lot when you sacrifice your 20s and your 30s and even some of your 40s, and you are just incredibly singularly focused on working in the hospital and operating and treating disease and rounding and seeing patients and taking calls. We were always on call. There was no idea of, someone's covering for me. We would still take the calls no matter where in the world we'd be. And it's so consuming that you don't get to ask the big question. And in my field, that big question is, why has the number of pancreatic cancer cases nearly doubled in the 20 years I'm in practice? No one's asking that question. And so now I'm doing exactly what I want to be doing. I love every aspect of my job, or jobs, in the sense that I do a lot of different things. I speak, I write, I get to teach, we do a lot of research, and I see patients. So right now I'm happy as a clam doing exactly what I want to be doing.
Well, that speaks to one of the prescriptions in my happiness book is seeking variety, whether it be food variety or intellectual variety. So I think by you wearing all of these different hats as part of your greater profession, it is tickling your penchant for variety, right?
Yeah. It's and I want to tell other students as they come through and they see my life and they tell me I want to do what you're doing, but there's no shortcut. You have to get through the system. You have to get the degree. You have to get the credentials, whatever in whatever field. You need to be respected in that field, and then you can have the authority to speak out about the broken system. But there's a lot of us now doing it. You may have seen Casey Means is out there
Yeah.
now. She also has a book. Her book came out just before my book, Blind Spots. Um, and for a while, her book was number one and mine was number two on Amazon. And I thought, gosh, this is amazing. I'm a big fan of Dr. Means. So many doctors like her, Jay Bhattacharya, Vinay Prasad, a whole bunch of docs, yourself, who are willing to be honest with the public. And we're not going to let the medical establishment control the narrative. We're going to speak up if we perceive that people are getting bad information or they should hear about a different point of view. Now, some people think that should be illegal, but if if they think that, then they may want to look at the opioid crisis and how the medical establishment did, putting out information on that, or any one of the many topics I go through in the book Blind Spots. Blind Spots is not meant to be a history book, although I have a chapter on sort of a short history of groupthink in medicine over the centuries, which is, I think, the funniest chapter from what people tell me. But
Well,
it's really meant to.
sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
It's really meant to educate people about health by telling them the backstory of how we ended up with the dogma today that still prevails.
Yeah, beautiful. In my forthcoming book is titled "Suicidal Empathy: How Dysregulated Empathy Can Result in All Sorts of bad policy, whether it be immigration or the homeless crisis or so on." I have a section where I talk about so-called hate speech and misinformation and disinformation and settled science. And I say that the second that you say something like settled science, you're actually advertising that you're not a scientist because I mean, scientific truths are provisional. That which we thought was true 300 years ago, we eventually updated, right? So you should never say that something is settled. And I actually give several examples that might interest you that are from the medical field. What is the gentleman's name? Is it Michael, the gentleman who ingested the virus to demonstrate that that's what caused the ulcers? He eventually won the Nobel Prize for it.
Yeah.
People were laughing at him. Semmelweis, the guy who childhood bed fever. Is it all in your book?
Yeah, I love it. Keep going. It's all in there. I love it.
The gentleman, the ophthalmologist who came up with cataract surgery. Oh, he's a bullshitter. This is nonsense. Now everybody loves him. So the idea that it's settled science, and if you say anything contrary to that, we're going to shut you down. We're going to take your medical license. We're going to close your YouTube channel. It amazes me, Marty, that in the 21st year, that reflex is still something that we see in the Western world. It's breathtaking. So I'm so thankful that there are guys like you, guys like Jay Bhattacharya that exist, because otherwise I'd be losing my mind.
Well, I don't know if you saw Bill Gates said, or I don't know if you saw him personally, since you live out there you're in the West Coast, right?
No, I often go to the West Coast, but I'm in Montreal, Canada. So
okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. But, so what were you going to say about Bill Gates?
Well, I was going to say also my School of Public Health professor said a Canadian is essentially an unarmed American with health insurance.
Right. Although it's not such a good thing to be unarmed in that I was threatened in person while walking with my son. And when I went to the police, they said, well, next time that you're threatened, just make sure to call 911, because the guy who wants to behead me is going to have the courtesy to say, oh, okay, I'll wait until the police responds before I behead you. So I think I prefer the Second Amendment to our castrated system. Marty, stay
You
on the
guys,
line. I'd like to say goodbye to you offline. Let me just remind people the full title of the book, Blind Spots When Medicine Gets It Wrong and What It Means for Our Health. You need to read that book. Thank you so much for coming on. Such a pleasure having you. I'm a big fan of your work. Come back anytime you'd like, and hopefully we'll get the chance to see each other in person soon.
would love that. Thank you so much, God.
Cheers. Take care.